Hello, my dear viewers. I wish you pleasant viewing and a wonderful day. I also look forward to your feedback in the comments. I had just returned from a meeting with the regional sales team, still riding the high of finalizing a complex logistics partnership when the storm arrived. Not the kind with thunder and lightning, worse. Stacy. She didn't knock. She never knocked. The door to my office swung open like it had been kicked. I barely had time to set down my laptop bag before she launched her latest tantrum into the air. "Fire that old hag," she snapped, her manicured finger jabbing toward the hallway. "Or you'll be sorry." I stared at her. "I'm sorry. What?" "Gina, the receptionist. She looked at me like I was a cockroach." I blinked. "Gina? The woman who brought in cookies every Friday? Who once stayed an hour after her shift to help a delivery guy carry boxes to our archive room?" "Stacy, Gina has been here longer than I have," I said, trying to keep the exhaustion out of my voice. "She's professional, courteous, and probably just startled by your entrance." Stacy folded her arms and glared. She was all eyeliner, lip gloss, and unearned confidence. 18 years old and already convinced the world owed her something. Her crop top had a luxury logo stretched across it like a billboard, and her sparkling nails clicked against the screen of her phone as she typed furiously, probably live tweeting her outrage. "Daddy said I could shadow in HR," she said. "He said I could help with staffing." "Shadowing doesn't mean decision-making." "It should!" she shrieked, throwing her arms up. "I'm not stupid, you know. I've been helping him make decisions for years. I told him to sell off that marketing firm last year, and guess what? He did, and the stock went up." I fought the urge to sigh. "That's not quite how it works, Stacy." "I don't like being ignored," she hissed. "I told you to fire her." "And I told you that's not how things are done around here." Her eyes narrowed, and something in her face shifted. A warning. "You'll regret this." Then she pivoted on her heels and stormed out, the scent of her floral perfume lingering in the air like smoke after a firecracker. I sat down slowly, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't the first time Stacy had caused chaos, but it was the first time she'd issued something so blatant, so personal. That night, I stayed late at the office. I double-checked policies, reviewed my notes, and flagged everything that had happened, because something told me this wasn't over. Stacy didn't take rejection well, not from her father, and certainly not from me. The next week, she was everywhere, bursting into team huddles, sitting in on interviews uninvited. At one point, she declared herself head of a newly invented department she called Creative Refresh, and tried to reassign 3 employees without a single form filed. "We need to rethink the vibe of the office," she said to me with a dead serious expression. "The walls are too gray. Gray kills creativity." She wanted to order neon beanbags and pastel murals for the break room. I politely redirected her toward marketing. She rolled her eyes and called me a dinosaur under her breath. She started pulling employee files from locked cabinets, rifling through performance reviews like she was flipping through a fashion magazine. When I confronted her, she didn't even flinch. "How else am I supposed to know who to cut? Daddy says streamlining is sexy." "Stacy," I said as firmly as I could, "this is a major confidentiality breach." She blinked at me, then raised her phone, snapped a selfie, and smirked. "You're seriously annoying." I reported her behavior to Greg Langston, our CEO, her father. He listened, nodded solemnly, and said all the right things. "Thanks for letting me know, Veronica. I'll speak to her." But the next morning, she marched into my office with a venti iced caramel latte in one hand and a smirk. "Daddy says you're loyal," she said, taking a loud sip. "But sometimes loyal people become predictable. Maybe it's time to shake things up." My pulse quickened. That wasn't just another tantrum. That was a warning shot. She wanted me out. I leaned back in my chair and met her eyes. "If you're planning a takeover, you might want to double-check your notes." She tilted her head. "What does that mean?" I smiled. "It means I'm not as boring as you think." because I had kept every incident documented. I had emails, security footage, a handful of very uncomfortable managers who'd watched her melt down and were too afraid to speak up. Until now. If Stacy wanted to play games, she was going to find out what happens when you go up against the woman who actually keeps the wheels turning. I wasn't just an employee, I was the glue, and she was about to find out just how strong I could be. A few months earlier, I had made a mistake. Not a glaring one. Not the kind you recognize in the moment. No, this one was insidious. A slow burn kind of error. A misjudgment wrapped in designer heels, and a last name that turned doors into revolving ones. Stacy Langston. She had just been anointed. Yes, anointed. Because no other word fits. A position she neither earned nor understood. Director of Strategic Integration. A title as bloated as her ego. No job description was ever formally distributed. No performance goals were established. It was, in essence, a vanity role invented to placate an heiress bored with Pilates and press-on nails. The announcement came during our quarterly town hall. Greg Langston, our CEO, stood at the podium, glowing with paternal pride. "She's going to help us bring a fresh, youthful perspective," he said, motioning to Stacy like she was a prize he'd just pulled out of a cereal box. Polite applause followed. Dutiful, thin. I didn't clap. I watched. And when the meeting ended, I approached her, not out of excitement, but out of strategy. I extended a hand, offered to help. I told myself I was doing it for the good of the company. That maybe, just maybe, if I guided her gently, she'd mature. I've worked with difficult people before. I've helped clueless interns blossom into competent managers. Why not this one? So I helped. Quietly. Discreetly. She forwarded emails she didn't understand. I rewrote them. She invited department heads to meetings without explaining the agenda. I called them afterward to apologize and clarify. I made cheat sheets on company policies. I explained acronyms she didn't bother Googling. I coached her through budget presentations she barely skimmed. There were brief glimmers of hope. One evening, after I stayed late helping her prep for a review, she looked at me and said, "Thanks, Ronnie. You're really smart." It was the most sincere thing she ever said to me. And the last. Because once she tasted authority, Stacy transformed. She began flaunting her title like a new handbag. Late to meetings she scheduled. Ignoring agendas. Interrupting senior staff to suggest fun updates, like mandatory TikTok challenges for marketing or casual Fridays that included pajamas. She started using office space like her personal runway, strutting through departments, critiquing desks, aesthetics, even people. One time, she looked at our facilities manager and said, "Ugh, can we not with the gray walls? It's giving mental asylum." I cringed. He laughed awkwardly. She didn't notice. Then came the power plays. She renamed internal teams, introduced chaotic workflows, created a vibe department that had no function beyond mood boards and essential oil diffusers. She ordered a project paused mid-cycle because she didn't like the fonts. She rescheduled quarterly reviews because they clashed with her yoga retreat. She asked a marketing director to consider using her dog in an ad campaign because he has more followers than our brand. People began coming to me, first in whispers, then in exhausted confessions. "Veronica, she just replaced my direct report with her sorority sister." She asked if she could vibe check our sales pitch. She made me delete the department Slack channel because she didn't like the emoji reactions. I kept trying to mediate. I whispered apologies, rewrote schedules, explained away the chaos. I still believed I could protect the team. But I was wrong. One Thursday, she stormed into the leadership roundtable with a stack of papers she'd printed in full color at the marketing office. They were new org charts, designed in Canva, with emojis and glitter font. She smiled like a debutante, revealing her bridal registry. "These are my ideas for restructuring. It's more inclusive, flattened hierarchy, feels more fresh." She had erased 3 senior roles. Entire departments were shuffled into obscure positions labeled culture optimization, and content energy. The room went silent. One of the VPs spilled his coffee. Another blinked, twice, in disbelief. Greg arrived 15 minutes late, glanced at the chaos, and chuckled. "Stacy's passionate. Let's give her some room to explore." That was my breaking point, not because of the emojis, not because of the disorganization, but because it was clear. No one was going to stop her. Not her father. Not the board. Not the senior leadership too afraid to cross the boss's daughter. She had been given power without responsibility, influence without accountability, and the longer she played CEO in training, the more damage she would do. So I made a decision. If no one else was going to put boundaries in place, I would. Not through confrontation, not with shouting matches or dramatic walkouts, but with records, with quiet observations, with a paper trail so detailed, so undeniable, that when the moment came, there would be no room for spin. She thought she could dance through the building like a fairy princess in combat boots, but I was the one keeping the lights on, and I was done cleaning up her glitter. It was a Wednesday, the kind of day that draped itself over your shoulders like a wet coat, unremarkable, mundane, but heavy. The office was quiet except for the muted clicking of keyboards and the occasional whoosh of the espresso machine down the hall. I had a to-do list longer than a CVS receipt, but I was making decent progress, chipping away at the quarterly performance evaluations like a sculptor with a dull chisel. I was halfway through annotating Kyle's review, solid designer, poor time manager, but brilliant under pressure, when I heard it. The sharp, impatient staccato of heels against tile. The sound carried through the hallway like a warning. And then, as expected, my glass door burst open without so much as a knock. Stacy Harper. All attitude, perfume, and designer rage. She strode in like she owned not just the company, but the concept of ownership itself. Her oversized sunglasses still perched on her head, a gold iPhone in one hand, a coffee in the other, which she promptly set down on my desk as if this were a brunch reservation and not a workplace. "Veronica," she snapped, "we need to talk. Now." I glanced up, deliberately calm. "Good morning to you, too." She ignored me and waved a manicured hand like she was swatting a fly. "This isn't social hour. We've got a problem." "We?" "Yes, we," she said, plopping into the guest chair with the grace of a toddler throwing a fit. "You need to fire the entire design team, today." I stopped writing, slowly set my pen down. "I'm sorry. What?" "They're toxic," she declared, pulling out her phone and scrolling as if she had receipts ready to go. Kyle rolled his eyes at me during the morning huddle. Ellie asked a follow-up question in a tone that was, frankly, condescending. And Miguel, he showed me 3 color palettes, and not one of them was lavender. I told him I wanted lavender. I stared at her, wondering if this was performance art. You want me to terminate an award-winning department because they didn't give you the exact shade of purple you wanted? She narrowed her eyes. "Don't twist my words, Veronica. It's about respect and safety. I don't feel safe when I'm being mocked." "You're not being mocked," I said firmly. "They're professionals, and you're being dramatic." She sat up straighter. "They don't take me seriously." "That's because you give them nothing to take seriously," I snapped, before I could stop myself. "You walk into meetings late, you talk over people, you change project scopes with no notice. They're not disrespecting you. They're surviving you." Her mouth dropped open. "How dare you—" "No," I said, rising from my chair. "How dare you? How dare you waltz in here with zero understanding of how hard these people work and try to burn their careers to the ground over petty grievances?" "They made me feel small," she said, lower now, eyes glassy but still furious. "I don't like feeling small." I softened, for just a second. "Then grow, learn, ask questions, show up on time, earn your place." She shot to her feet. "I don't have to earn anything. I'm the director of strategic integration. My father—" "Yes," I cut in. "Your father gave you that title, but titles don't lead teams. People do. Respect does. And right now, you have none. Her face turned the color of raw meat. Then maybe it's time we had a director of operations who actually respects leadership. Is that a threat? It's a promise. I'll go to him, Veronica. I'll tell him you're undermining me, that you're creating a hostile environment. I didn't flinch. Go ahead. You think you're untouchable? No, but I think I'm right. And if your father fires me because I refuse to execute a personal vendetta, that says more about him than it does about me. The silence between us pulsed like a heartbeat. I'm giving you until 5 o'clock, she hissed. Either that department is gone, or you are. And with that, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the glass shook. I stood there for a long time, hands resting lightly on the back of my chair, heart beating steadily. Not with fear, with certainty. I'd been through worse. I'd survived acquisitions, layoffs, a data breach, and a client scandal that nearly sunk us. But nothing, not even the 20-hour days, was more exhausting than trying to reason with someone who'd never had to earn a thing in her life. What Stacy didn't know was that I had already documented every encounter, every email, every absurd directive. I'd been warned about her from the beginning by people who didn't last. But I had. I had survived her long enough to know what came next. She was going to her father, and I was going to make sure he read every word she wanted to keep buried. The Harper and Vale Winter Gala was an annual ritual of excess, a glittering performance where designer heels clicked across marble floors. Laughter was just a little too loud, and every handshake masked a silent calculation. The ballroom at the high-rise downtown was glowing with chandeliers and silver drapery. A live jazz band played tasteful covers of 80s ballads. A champagne tower sparkled in the corner, like a promise no one believed. I stood by one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city blur beneath us. Frost etched delicate lace along the glass. The whole evening smelled like expensive perfume, money, and denial. Across the room, Stacy was holding court near the chocolate fountain, dressed in a sapphire blue gown that shimmered with every exaggerated laugh she gave. Her hair was done to perfection, her smile calibrated to draw in anyone useful. She looked like the queen of some preposterous teen drama. And yet, something about her was off. She wasn't flitting between conversations like usual. She wasn't cornering the marketing team with another impossible demand about redefining brand synergy or a rebrand inspired by lunar cycles. No. Tonight, she was quiet, almost careful, watching people the way predators do when they're not hungry, but still feel like killing something for sport. I was mid-sip of my second glass of Prosecco, making polite conversation with Evelyn from finance about the latest round of budget forecasts when my phone buzzed in my clutch. One glance at the screen, and the chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the weather. From Charles Harper, subject. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. My office, no greeting, no explanation, just a digital guillotine with a timestamp. I didn't react outwardly. I smiled at Evelyn and excused myself with a vague comment about refilling my drink. But inside, every cell in my body snapped to alert. This wasn't a casual check-in. This wasn't routine. This was it. I made my way to the far end of the venue, where the noise dimmed near the bathrooms and coat check. My fingers curled around my phone, scrolling through the brief message again. Short, cold, sharp, the kind of message you send when you've made up your mind. Stacy had finally pulled the trigger. I locked myself in a bathroom stall, away from the music and voices and blinking fairy lights, and leaned back against the wall. I knew this was coming. I had seen the way she watched me this past week, calculating, tight-lipped, smug in that uniquely entitled way of people who have never had to be truly competent to get what they want. But what she didn't know, what she'd never suspected, was that I had been watching her too. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted folder I'd been quietly compiling for weeks. At first, it was just a backup plan, a way to cover myself when her behavior got out of hand. I'd seen too many competent people, especially women, get destroyed for less than what Stacy pulled in a single week. But over time, the file had grown into something else. A record, a shield, a fuse. There were screenshots, Slack messages, emails, even one she mistakenly sent to me instead of her friend, where she bragged about cutting loose dead weight before Q1 reporting. That dead weight was someone on our admin team who had just returned from medical leave. There was audio. Stacy berating a junior analyst for embarrassing her by asking a question during a client demo. A 30-second voice memo where she clearly said, "Either Veronica gets rid of the old woman in HR, or I'll tell Daddy she's insubordinate. He listens to me." There were expense reports flagged by finance, 3 different company-paid luxury deliveries to her apartment, all marked under consulting fees. And then there was the leaked invoice, $18,000 paid to a boutique marketing firm owned by one of her college friends, with 0 deliverables produced. When procurement pressed her, she told them to stay in their lane. I had all of it. I'd even gone further. I had pulled up internal performance reviews that showed a consistent pattern of complaints. People requesting transfers after being placed under Stacy, citing a hostile work environment, emotional volatility, and fear of retaliation. Some of those reports had mysteriously disappeared from our HR system. I found them in backups. She had been sloppy, entitled, reckless, and her biggest mistake was underestimating the woman who smiled politely while documenting everything. Back at my apartment that night, I sat at my desk in silence. The city glowed outside my window, cars gliding like insects along the wet pavement, neon signs blinking with tired energy. I was calm, methodical. I opened a fresh email. To Charles Harper, subject. Ahead of our meeting, Charles. In preparation for our scheduled meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m., I wanted to ensure you had full visibility into a number of internal concerns I've documented over the past several weeks. Attached, you'll find a folder containing evidence of procedural violations, expense inconsistencies, and repeated instances of workplace misconduct. All files are time-stamped, verified, and in compliance with our internal ethics protocols. I trust you will review the information carefully. Regards, Veronica Lane, Director of Operations. I attached the zip file, triple-checked every document, renamed the file. For review, Internal Conduct Breach, Confidential. Then I hit send. Not with anger, not with panic, with precision. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't theater, it was protection, for the people Stacy had mistreated, for the company she was burning from the inside out. And, if I was being honest, for myself. I closed the laptop, poured myself a glass of red wine, and sat on the couch in the quiet. Tomorrow, I would walk into that meeting prepared for a dismissal. But maybe, just maybe, I'd be the one watching someone else walk out. The morning air was sharper than usual, slicing through my coat as I stepped out of the cab. Frost clung to the pavement, and the wind whipped around the towering glass building like it was trying to warn me not to go inside. But I didn't hesitate. My heels clicked with purpose as I crossed the lobby, nodded at the security guard, and entered the elevator. I didn't check my reflection. I didn't need to. By now, I knew how I looked when I was about to burn something down. The executive floor was unnaturally quiet, as if the air itself had tightened in anticipation. Jenna, Charles Harper's executive assistant, gave me a look that said everything her corporate smile didn't: sympathy, curiosity, and a hint of warning. She gestured toward the large oak door. "He's expecting you." Of course he was. I knocked once, then let myself in. Charles Harper looked up from behind his imposing desk. The office, massive, glass-walled, pristine, had the usual understated wealth. A framed photo of him with a senator, a shelf of business books no one had ever opened, a tasteful but meaningless sculpture. His tie was slightly loosened, and he looked like he hadn't slept. "Veronica," he said, "please, sit." I did. Calmly, back straight, no fidgeting. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to check your email first." His mouth stayed open for a beat, his eyes narrowing. But something in my voice must have clipped through his usual executive bravado. He paused, then turned to his screen. Silence fell. He clicked, opened the message. I watched as he scrolled through the files. His pupils widened slightly as recognition set in. He clicked again. Audio, most likely. Stacy's voice filled the air, clear and unmistakable, even at low volume. If Veronica doesn't fire that old hag and admin, I'll make her wish she never stepped foot in this company. He didn't look at me. He just hit pause, then clicked again. More evidence. Screenshots, financial logs, Slack messages, invoices, timeline spreadsheets. I said nothing. Let the silence do the talking. When he finally leaned back, he looked like someone who had just been hit by a truck made of hard truths. His face was pale, jaw tight, hands folded in front of his mouth. Where did you get all of this? I documented it over the past 3 months. Most of it I witnessed firsthand. Some came from others, people too afraid to speak, but they trusted me to hold it. His voice was low. Why didn't you come to me sooner? I raised an eyebrow. Would it have mattered? He winced. I leaned forward slightly. This isn't gossip. It's not a misunderstanding. It's systematic abuse, Charles. Financial misconduct, harassment, blackmail. I gave you the chance to hear it first, because I still, somewhere, believe this company can do better. He exhaled heavily. Veronica, I had no idea. She told me. She said you were undermining her, being territorial, blocking her ideas. I gave him a cold smile. She's very good at rewriting reality. You should know. You've let her do it for years. His face hardened. She's my daughter. And I'm your director of operations, I said. I've been loyal to this company for almost a decade. I've pulled departments out of chaos, managed crises, delivered results. You let her treat me and others like we were disposable. He rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking older than I'd ever seen him. If the board sees this, he trailed off. I waited. He straightened, trying to gather the threads of control. Veronica, I need to ask you something. Please don't take this to the board. Not yet. Not yet? I repeated, my voice flat. If this goes public, it'll destroy her, he said. The press, the shareholders, the reputation of this company. It'll all unravel. Charles, I said quietly, it already has. The only difference is whether you take control of the fallout or let it explode behind your back. She's my daughter. And I'm not asking you to stop loving her, I replied. But if you protect her now, you're saying that what she did is acceptable, that it's worth hiding, that the people she hurt, the careers she nearly ended, they don't matter. He looked at me, torn, caught between blood and business, between guilt and the undeniable evidence staring at him from his own screen. I can't let this go to the board, he said again, more softly this time. I need time. Let me address it internally, quietly. No. His head snapped up. You can have until Friday, I said, standing. 3 days. I expect formal action, a written report, an HR audit, and her resignation, public, clear, and permanent. And if I don't, then every file goes to the board, and legal, and, if necessary, the media. His silence was thunderous. I came to you first because I thought you still had integrity, I said. Don't prove me wrong. I turned to leave, my hand on the door. Veronica, he said behind me, his voice hollow. You're not bluffing, are you? I glanced over my shoulder. If I were, you'd already be safe. And with that, I walked out. If Charles Harper thought Stacy would go quietly, he clearly didn't know his daughter. The morning after our meeting, I noticed the first crack. My calendar had been tampered with. I had a standing 10:30 a.m. operations huddle every Wednesday, one I led without fail. That morning, the invite was gone, deleted. I checked twice, then checked my backups. Nothing. When I messaged the team, I got a few awkward responses. Thought the meeting was canceled? Stacy rescheduled. Said it conflicted with new strategy blocks. Oh, you weren't looped in? No, I hadn't been. Then it began in earnest. Stacy waged her war the only way she knew how, through manipulation, back channels, and small venomous cuts designed to exhaust and isolate me. Entire project threads I had started suddenly excluded me. Group chats where decisions were made overnight, without my input. Budget documents I had approved mysteriously reverted to in-review status with no explanation. Teams were being pulled into last-minute strategy sessions led by Stacy, sessions that often contradicted our roadmap. The first time I addressed it, she smiled sweetly in front of everyone. "Oh, sorry, Veronica. Thought I added you. Total oversight." But the second time? The third? By the fourth, it wasn't an oversight. It was a message. I was being frozen out. She was rearranging workflows, bypassing protocol, redirecting everything through her. She wanted chaos, wanted me drowning in the aftermath of her edits, corrections, and vanishing approvals. She was banking on one thing, that I would get tired, that I would either break down or break rank. I did neither. Instead, I adapted. I dusted off the old skills, the ones you use when systems fail and politics get dirty. I stopped relying on digital threads and started showing up in person. I walked to departments. I had face-to-face updates with teams instead of chasing down elusive inboxes. When she canceled meetings, I rescheduled them myself, with clear, time-stamped invites. When she blocked access to shared documents, I pulled data straight from the internal dashboards. When she rerouted project proposals to her strategy desk, I copied legal on every follow-up. And I kept a record, a quiet, growing vault of every maneuver she made. January 14th. Reassigned marketing budget routing to her own signature line. No formal process. January 16th. Removed me from vendor negotiation chain with WebWave. Contract delayed 3 days. January 19th. Reintroduced a scrapped internal campaign and presented it as her idea. Included error we had already fixed. January 22nd. Scheduled mandatory staff training during ops review cycle. Canceled twice without notice. Each entry in the document wasn't just a petty act, it was ammunition, and she had no idea I was gathering it. The mood in the office began to shift. Quietly, subtly, people noticed. In meetings, colleagues started glancing at me with silent questions in their eyes. Some began forwarding me threads I'd been excluded from. A few even started coming to me directly, off the record. "Veronica, I'm not sure who to go to anymore. She said we're restructuring reporting lines. She told me legal approved this, but I can't find the sign-off. She's asking me to remove line items from the vendor contract. Do I have to do that?" I answered all of them. Calmly, with references and receipts, and I copied myself on everything, because Stacy thought loyalty could be bought. But trust? That had to be earned. And I had earned mine. Still, she pushed harder. One Friday, I stayed late to clean up yet another budget file she'd mangled. When I opened the shared drive, I found an entire folder missing. 2 months of planning documentation for our spring product launch. Gone. My chest tightened for the first time in days. I checked the backup drive. It was there, but marked archived. Someone had manually altered permissions to lock me out. I didn't panic. I documented it, restored the folder, and flagged it in the master log. And then, as a final touch, I printed every item I had. Hard copies, bound in 2 thick folders. One for me, one for the board. Because eventually, someone would have to ask the right question. Who is really causing the disruption here? And when they did, I'd be ready. Back in my office that night, long after the cleaning crew had passed through, I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp. My tea had gone cold. My inbox was quiet for the first time all week. The air was still. Stacy believed pressure broke people. But I wasn't breaking. I was crystallizing. And the more she pressed, the sharper I became. Some battles you fight alone. Others, you win by knowing exactly who to bring into the war. I had reached the point where being silent wasn't an act of professionalism anymore. It was enabling. Stacy had shifted from being a nuisance to a genuine threat, not just to my sanity or my position, but to the company itself. She was playing games with real-world consequences, and worse, she believed no one would stop her. That's where she was wrong. It started with Lolly Brenner. Lolly, our head of compliance, had been at Harper & Vale just as long as I had, and in that time, she had developed the kind of institutional memory you couldn't pay for. People underestimated her constantly. Maybe it was the soft Midwestern accent, the oversized sweaters, or the constant knitting during town halls. But under the wool and warmth was a meticulous mind that operated like a laser-guided missile. I knocked on her office door late one afternoon, closing it behind me before she could wave me in. She looked up from her desk, her tea steaming beside her, and immediately narrowed her eyes. "I assume this isn't about Q4 disclosures," she said. "No," I replied. "It's about Stacy, and it's bad." Her expression didn't change. She simply pushed aside her keyboard and said, "Start from the beginning." I laid it all out. The altered budgets, the falsified timelines, the internal memos that vanished or returned with her edits disguised under someone else's name. I told her about the vendor reroutes, the suspicious personal expenses labeled as creative reinvestment, and the messages she'd sent that bordered on blackmail. Lolly listened, silent. Her pen never stopped moving. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is enough to trigger a full audit. Internally, we could escalate it. Externally, it could raise red flags with regulators." "I know, but we need proof. Solid proof." Her eyes met mine. "Then let's get it." What followed was a week-long excavation. Lolly dove into the system like a surgeon, examining approval logs, matching IP addresses to login timestamps, identifying when Stacy accessed certain documents and when they were mysteriously changed. She had a skill for spotting the inconsistencies others missed, patterns no one else thought to look for. "She's not just careless," Lolly told me one evening, sliding over a printout of system access reports. "She's calculated. Look at the timing. 2:17 a.m., 3:41 a.m., always right after we push new files to legal or finance. She waits, then sneaks in edits." I stared at the data. "She's covering her tracks." "She thinks she is," Lolly corrected. That's when we brought in Jimmy Quinn. Harper & Vale's in-house counsel wasn't flashy, but he was sharp and unshakable. Jimmy had the laid-back charm of someone who grew up surfing in San Diego, but spoke in legal clauses like they were his first language. He once disassembled a hostile takeover attempt with nothing but a cup of coffee and a folder full of NDAs. We met in his office after hours, blinds drawn. I closed the door and placed a copy of our findings on the table. "I need your legal opinion," I said, "and your discretion." Jimmy glanced at the first page, then the second. He didn't speak for a while. He flipped through quietly, eyebrows lifting only once, on page 7, where we'd highlighted Stacy's attempts to mislabel company funds used for a brand consultant who turned out to be a personal stylist. Finally, he leaned back and whistled. "She's digging her own grave." "I want the whole to be legal," I said. He smirked. "Then let's draw the chalk outline together." We built what Jimmy called the litigation packet, a detailed, time-stamped, evidence-backed chronology of every known violation. He ensured every screenshot, document, and testimony we collected was stored with digital certificates verifying authenticity. We watermarked internal memos. We tracked the metadata of every suspicious edit. Every page had a chain of custody. There would be no claims of fabrication, no way out through denial, and most importantly, we kept it quiet. Lolly coordinated her efforts from the compliance side, quietly interviewing department leads, compiling procedural breaches, and reviewing finance reports for anomalies. Jimmy worked in parallel, cross-checking everything with labor laws, corporate bylaws, and federal business regulations. We had to be strategic. Too much exposure, and Stacy might catch wind and go scorched earth. Meanwhile, I reached out, discreetly, to team leads and mid-level managers who'd been burned by Stacy's arrogance but too afraid to speak up. I asked for specific incidents. I told them I would protect their names. They gave me dates, direct quotes, and corroborating emails. She told me I'd be restructured out if I didn't stop asking questions about vendor vetting. She submitted a budget that included a trip to Paris labeled as a retreat, but it was just her and her friend. She threatened to blacklist me if I didn't revise my performance review of her. Their voices were quiet, but their stories were damning. As the file grew, so did the weight of it, not just in pages, but in meaning. This wasn't just about Stacy's incompetence anymore. It was about integrity, about the kind of company Harper & Vale was becoming under her influence. And I knew, if we let it fester any longer, it wouldn't just be a few bruised egos or budgets lost. It would be our entire culture. By the end of the week, Lolly looked at me across her desk, her knitting paused mid-row. "It's ready," she said. "What we've got. It's not just strong, it's nuclear." I nodded, and for the first time in months, I let myself feel the smallest flicker of relief. Because Stacy had tried to burn me down with chaos, but I had built my case brick by brick, with people who knew how to fight with facts. And now, we were ready to drop the match. When Stacy schemed, she used the boardroom. When I moved, I used the city. It was late afternoon when I got the message from Lizzie Chen. Just a single line. "You free tonight? Let's talk." No subject line, no details. But when someone like Lizzie from Eastbridge Global calls, you say yes, even if you're on fire. We met at our usual spot, a discreet wine bar nestled between two art galleries on a cobbled stretch of 7th. The kind of place where the music was low, the waitstaff wore black, and the clientele knew how to keep conversations private. Lizzie was already at the back table, sipping a glass of Tempranillo and dressed like someone who ran multinational acquisitions before breakfast. Because she did. She was Eastbridge's lead liaison, our biggest investor, and more importantly, one of the few people in my life who understood exactly how much power hides behind silence. "Veronica," she said, her eyes sharp as ever, "you look calm." "I'm not," I replied honestly, "but I'm in control." She smiled. "That's better than calm." We chatted for a few minutes, business updates, supply chain drama, the usual quiet gossip about which firm might be next on Eastbridge's list. Then she set her glass down and leaned in. "I'm going to be blunt," she said. "Stacy's name is coming up in every internal report we've reviewed in the last quarter. Investors are asking questions. Your CEO is stalling. And I hear through channels that your name came up in a closed-door board conversation." I met her gaze. "Let me guess, as a problem?" "As a problem," she confirmed, "for the people making messes, not for us." I said nothing. She took a slow breath. "Veronica, if they fire you, we terminate the partnership." I blinked. No preamble, no conditions. She said it like it was fact, because it was. "Just like that?" I asked. She nodded. "We don't build billion-dollar partnerships with chaos. We build them with operators, and we don't let ego-driven trust fund kids gamble with our investments." I felt the weight of her words settle into my chest, not as pressure, but as power. "That's a hell of a trump card," I said softly. "You're the reason Harper & Vale's numbers stabilized. The reason we didn't pull out last year. You held the damn thing together while that girl burned through budgets like confetti." "Charles won't like ultimatums." She smirked. "Good. I didn't send one. This is informal, a friendly warning." A pause. Then her voice dropped slightly. "If they push you out to protect her, we walk. Quietly, but fast." I sat back in my chair, heartbeat steady now. Lizzie had just confirmed what Stacy would never see coming. Her worst threat wasn't the board, or HR, or even legal. It was me, holding the goodwill of our most powerful partner in the palm of my hand. "I hope it won't come to that," I said. She smiled again. "Me too. But I thought you should know." You're not fighting this alone. We clinked glasses, one soft sound in a room full of low whispers. And just like that, the balance shifted. The email came in at 8:03 a.m. sharp. Subject: Administrative leave notification. Immediate implementation. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of my contributions, no explanation beyond vague legal phrasing. Just a cold, official-sounding message, signed off by someone from legal I'd only spoken to once in passing. It read, Veronica, effective immediately, you are placed on temporary administrative leave, pending an internal review of your recent conduct. Please refrain from accessing company systems and await further instructions. Thank you. Office of Corporate Counsel, no HR meeting, no phone call, just an email. As if 10 years of service, of pulling this company through chaos and quarters on fire, could be erased with a few typed lines. I stared at the screen for several moments, my expression unreadable. It wasn't shock, it wasn't even anger, it was confirmation of exactly what I had suspected. Charles Harper had folded. He'd made his choice. He thought removing me, quietly, temporarily, would be enough to placate Stacy and still give him time to mop up the rest. He didn't realize he'd just pulled the trigger on the very contingency plan I'd built to survive this exact betrayal. Because while he had been trying to balance legacy and loyalty, I had been preparing for war. By 8:12 a.m., the sealed evidence folders, 3 in total, were being personally delivered to each member of Harper & Vale's board of directors. Jimmy and Lolly had each taken a copy, and Jenna, the CEO's assistant, carried the third directly into the boardroom. The folders were not digital. They were physical, hefty and undeniable, with clear plastic tabs color-coded by category: financial fraud, procedural violations, harassment, and threats. Every section backed by legally admissible documentation. At the front of the packet, a typed letter signed by Lolly and Jimmy, co-stamped with the company's internal compliance and legal seals. This report contains verified and substantiated violations committed by Stacy Harper, Director of Strategic Integration. If unaddressed, these violations expose Harper & Vale to regulatory audits, breach of fiduciary duty, reputational risk, and potential civil litigation. Action is recommended within 48 hours. At 8:17 a.m., Eastbridge Global made their move. Lizzie's email wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. To the Harper & Vale board, we have observed recent developments with concern. Director Lane's sudden removal undermines operational continuity and reflects a troubling disregard for oversight and internal risk management. If her termination proceeds, Eastbridge Global will invoke Clause 9B of our investment agreement: immediate suspension of active projects, withdrawal of pledged funds, and a strategic reevaluation of our partnership. Lizzie Chen, Eastbridge Global VP, Strategic Investments. In other words, protect Veronica or watch your funding evaporate. At 8:23 a.m., Charles Harper summoned the board. He must have seen the firestorm before it fully landed. His assistant looked panicked. She told me, later, that his voice had been tight, his fingers trembling as he tapped out the internal alert. The emergency session was marked mandatory, board only, no delays. By 8:35 a.m., the top floor's executive suite, usually reserved for quarterly planning and performance reviews, was sealed shut. Security stood outside. Coffee went untouched. Phones were silenced. Inside, every board member was flipping through the audit packet with furrowed brows and tightening mouths. By 8:45 a.m., Lolly and Jimmy were presenting slide decks that no one interrupted. Facts were facts. Contracts don't lie. Timestamps, voice recordings, emails from Stacy's own account, all arranged in damning chronological order. The accusations weren't vague anymore. Backdated approvals on vendor contracts totaling $86,000, misuse of funds earmarked for employee wellness, redirected to personal services, threats against junior staff to fabricate success metrics, alteration of performance reviews for personal enemies, unauthorized access to HR records to dig for dirt on internal critics. The board went from confused to silent to furious. Charles tried to speak, tried to say he hadn't seen all of this, that maybe this had been exaggerated. Jimmy shut that down. "This isn't speculation," he said, tone deadly calm. "This is your company's liability, and unless it's addressed today, it becomes your personal liability." At 9:02 a.m., someone asked the inevitable, "Where is Stacy?" She wasn't in the building. She hadn't logged into Slack, hadn't responded to emails, hadn't arrived at her office. She'd disappeared. "She knew this was coming," Lolly said flatly. "She's in damage control mode." One board member stood up, red-faced. "So you suspend the woman holding this place together and let the one sinking it vanish into thin air?" By 9:07 a.m., the tone had shifted. No one was talking about reviewing my suspension. They were talking about reversing it, about issuing a formal inquiry, about firing Stacey Harper for cause. The first call came at 9:48 a.m. Charles Harper. The screen lit up quietly on the corner of my desk, his name hovering like smoke. I stared at it, unmoved, until it stopped ringing. He tried again at 9:55, and again at 10:02. 3 calls, no voicemail, no apology. Each one went unanswered. I didn't ignore him out of spite. I ignored him because the time for conversations had passed. We were no longer in the same arena. I wasn't a subordinate to be managed. I was the one who had managed to survive, to outmaneuver, and most importantly, to protect the company he had nearly let collapse under the weight of nepotism and cowardice. At 10:30 a.m., a new email arrived, not from him, but from the board office. Subject: Request for attendance, emergency executive session. Time: 11 a.m. Location: boardroom, 31st floor. There was no detail, no apology, no instructions, just a single sentence. The board would like to hear from you directly. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I stood, straightened my blazer, and walked to the elevator. Not rushed, not nervous, just ready. The ride to the 31st floor was quiet, the mirrored walls reflecting a calm, composed woman who'd spent months preparing for this exact moment. Not to be vindicated, but to be heard. And to lead. The boardroom was already assembled when I entered. The long mahogany table stretched beneath glass lighting. 12 members, each with a folder, a tablet, and expressions that ranged from wary curiosity to guarded respect. Judith Raines, the chair, nodded toward the vacant seat at the far end. I noticed Charles immediately, standing off to the side, not seated, not speaking. His face was pale, drawn, his tie loose. He looked like a man already removed from his own legacy. I took the seat offered to me, sat tall. Judith spoke first. "Ms. Lane, thank you for coming on short notice." I inclined my head. "Of course. We've reviewed the evidence submitted by compliance and legal. The scope and gravity of the misconduct is clear. But before we move to formal action, we want to hear your account. On the record." There was a pause, a collective inhale. And then I began. I didn't speak from anger. I didn't dramatize. I didn't embellish. I presented facts, the timeline, the obstruction, the quiet sabotages, the financial irregularities. I detailed how Stacey had systematically compromised operational flow, exploited vendor contracts, and bullied staff to maintain a facade of success while draining resources and morale. I cited policies. I referenced protocols. I named every check she bypassed and every gate she kicked open using her last name as a key. I explained how, despite all of it, I had chosen to act quietly, legally, by building a case with compliance and legal instead of retaliating. I explained why. Because I believed in this company. Because people had placed their trust in me. And because sometimes the only way to fight corruption was not to scream, but to prove it. I laid out my proposals. Implementation of a formal executive accountability framework. quarterly audit review panels involving external advisors, a cross-functional ethics committee with real decision-making power, enhanced protections for whistleblowers, and a restructured onboarding process for leadership roles, including psychological and cultural fit assessments. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Judith leaned forward. "Veronica, I want to thank you for your integrity, for your clarity, and for the work you've done not only to protect Harper and Vale, but to preserve its future." She turned to the rest of the board, then back to me. "The board has reached two decisions." My hands rested gently on the table. First, Stacey Harper is to be terminated immediately for cause. Her access has already been revoked, and legal has been instructed to initiate formal severance review with no retention package. There were no objections. Second, Charles Harper will step aside for a period of 60 days under temporary suspension. During that time, the board will conduct a full governance review, including an evaluation of his ability to remain in leadership. Charles said nothing. His face was drained of color. And then Judith turned back to me. "In light of this crisis, and the leadership vacuum exposed, we are offering you the position of Interim Chief Operating Officer, effective today." I didn't speak right away. Because this was not a victory parade. It was a turning point, and I wanted to honor the weight of it. "Thank you," I said. "I accept." There were no cheers, no champagne, just a quiet, unified nod around the table. But it was enough. I stood, offered my hand to Judith, and shook hers firmly. As I left the room, I didn't look back at Charles. I didn't need to. Because I hadn't won by force. I had won by surviving, by outlasting, and by never lowering my standards, even when everyone around me did. And that, I knew, was the true beginning of something better. Stacey Harper disappeared the way a broken illusion does, fast, quiet, and without ceremony. There was no announcement, no farewell post on LinkedIn, not even a staged photo of her boarding a plane with a Louis Vuitton carry-on and a caption about new beginnings. One day, she was storming offices in stilettos. The next, gone. The story circulated fast and loose. A cross-cultural strategy immersion, an elite international rotation, a top-secret expansion initiative in Europe. In truth, Stacey had been shipped off to our smallest foreign outpost, a semi-operational satellite office in Luxembourg that handled overflow files from the marketing division. The position they gave her was meaningless. There were no teams, no campaigns, just a desk, a title, and a very clear message: "You're out." And while they didn't fire her outright, they might as well have. She would no longer touch strategy. She would no longer influence hiring. And most crucially, she would no longer threaten the company's future. Charles Harper, for his part, tried to hang on. He called a few more meetings, tried to act like nothing had changed. But the board had turned. So had the partners. And he knew better than to hold a burning rope. 3 days after Stacey's silent departure, he submitted his resignation. The message he sent out to staff was short and vague. "After much reflection, I've decided to step away to focus on personal matters and my family. I remain deeply proud of what we've built, and I have full faith in the company's next chapter." It felt more like a retreat than a goodbye. No one threw him a farewell party. And then, for the first time in months, everything went still. No drama, no demands, no hallway whispers or suspicious calendar invites. It was the sound of the storm finally breaking. 2 weeks later, I was invited to a private meeting with the board. It wasn't held in the usual conference room. This one took place in the executive retreat space. High ceilings, closed drapes, and a long marble table that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and power. There were only 6 people seated: Judith Raines, now acting CEO, the CFO, legal, compliance, 2 senior partners from the board's oversight committee. "Veronica," Judith said as I sat down, "we're not going to dance around this." She slid a folder across the table. Inside, a formal offer. "Vice President, International Division, Global Strategy, Operations Oversight, Compliance Liaison. It was more than a title, it was access, authority, trust. "You've done more than salvage a crisis," Judith said. "You've proven how this company should be led." I closed the folder slowly. "I have conditions," I said. They nodded in unison. "First," I began, "zero tolerance for nepotism. That includes hiring, promotion, or decision-making privileges. If we rebuild trust, it must be earned, not inherited." Judith responded without hesitation. "Implemented company-wide. Any legacy appointments are under review." "Second," I said, "complete operational autonomy. My division, my team, my metrics. No red tape from HQ. I won't operate under politics." "You'll report to the board quarterly," she said. "Other than that, you set your own charter." "Third," I added, "accountability. Not just for me, for everyone. We need quarterly ethics audits, anonymous reporting structures, and a direct line between compliance and the executive suite." The CFO shifted. "That could rattle some old bones." "It's time they were rattled," I said. Silence. Then Judith extended her hand. "Then it's yours." I shook it, steady and sure. "I'll need a week to plan the transition," I said. "My first order of business is not launching global strategy. It's repairing morale." I spent the next 3 weeks reshaping the soul of Harper & Vale. I promoted people who had been buried in middle management for years. I reinstated analysts who'd left quietly under Stacy's reign. I opened anonymous feedback channels, and most importantly, I showed up at every department meeting, in every office, and even on the production floor. Not to be seen. To listen. To prove we weren't just changing names on doors, we were rewriting the rules. When I finally walked into my new office, 32nd floor, glass walls, clean desk, I didn't bring flowers or framed photos, just my laptop, my old audit notebook, and a blank pad labeled New Foundation. As I sat down, a quiet email pinged in my inbox, from Lizzie. "Congrats, VP Lane. Told you weren't fighting alone. Let's get to work." And I smiled, because I hadn't won through revenge. I hadn't clawed my way to the top through whispers or back doors. I had earned it, one quiet battle at a time. And now, it was time to lead. For real. The first ripple of change didn't come from a press release or a flashy campaign. It came from a simple email. Subject: contract renewal. Eastbridge Global was back. Not just back, but expanding their contract. The same firm that once threatened to sever ties, unless I was reinstated, now wanted to co-develop new tech infrastructure across 3 continents. With me at the helm. Lizzie wrote personally, "We recognize real leadership when we see it. Whatever you're building now, we want in." That message was a turning point. The next week, 2 other clients we hadn't heard from in months reached out. One requested a private sit-down. Another said they had newfound confidence in Harper & Vale's direction. And soon, what had once been a trickle turned into a flood. Vendors began offering longer terms. Prospects, who'd once used Stacy's antics as a reason to decline meetings, now proactively sought introductions. News traveled, fast and true, through back-channel phone calls and industry whispers. Harper & Vale cleaned house, and they're better for it. The damage Stacy had done wasn't erased, but it was being outpaced by transparency, by competence, and by results. Inside the company, the atmosphere changed like the first breeze before spring. Departments that had once operated in isolation started scheduling cross-functional sessions. Managers that used to guard information like dragons now shared resources freely. Even the tension in elevators, the hush when senior leadership entered, vanished. There were no more stares over shoulders, no more hushed warnings of, "Don't cross her." People weren't afraid anymore. They were hopeful. In my own team, the transformation was deeper. I promoted from within. People who had once been interrupted in meetings were now leading them. Analysts who once watered down their reports out of fear now submitted them with pride and sometimes blunt honesty. We implemented a new mantra across every division I oversaw. Titles are earned, but trust is proven. It wasn't just a line for the wall, it was culture. New hires were evaluated not just for skill, but for character. We embedded anonymous ethics checks into every quarterly cycle. Peer feedback became standard, even for leadership. And at least once a month, I sat in on department meetings, not to audit, but to listen. People spoke differently when they knew their voices mattered. And as for me, I didn't sit behind closed doors. I walked the floors, ate lunch with interns, took calls from junior staff who had ideas they were once afraid to share. Respect, I realized, wasn't about command. It was about presence. The accolades came slowly at first. An industry magazine listed me in their top 100 operational leaders to watch. Then a feature in Modern Executive titled, Turning Ruin into Resilience, the woman who changed a company from the inside. I got emails from other women, mid-level directors, HR leads, legal consultants, sharing their own stories of being undermined, overlooked, quietly targeted. Your story made me feel less crazy. Thank you for not staying quiet. I thought I was alone. That's when I knew this wasn't about my personal redemption anymore. It was about something bigger. I started mentoring, quietly. No big programs, just one-on-one coffee chats, Zooms after hours, quiet conversations in glass offices where people could finally admit, I'm trying to lead, but I'm drowning. And I listened. Because if I had one legacy to leave behind, it wouldn't be titles or revenue graphs. It would be this. No one else would have to fight blind like I did. Not under my watch. Stacy, meanwhile, was living what looked like the dream. If you followed her social media anyway, she posted daily from cafes in Paris, yoga studios in Florence, lounges in Berlin. She hashtagged everything. Boss life, executive jet lag, boardroom abroad. But the comments were sparse, engagement low. And behind the filters and smiling brunch selfies, the truth whispered out like smoke. She wasn't respected. No one responded to her pitches. The strategic partners she mentioned didn't exist. The events she attended? She wasn't on the guest lists. She bought tickets like everyone else. She spoke, but only to small rooms who came for the catering. And back at Harper and Vale, she was never mentioned. She'd become a myth, a cautionary tale. Even her last name no longer held weight. She hadn't been fired, but she had been forgotten. One evening, weeks after Eastbridge renewed, I stood in the center of my new office. Just me, a cup of tea, and the skyline reflecting in the windows. It wasn't the tallest office, or the fanciest, but it had light and quiet, and that mattered more. My phone buzzed with a final message from Judith. Board voted unanimously. Promotion ratified. Title formalized. Congratulations, Vice President Lane. I smiled, not because it was a triumph, but because it wasn't. It was the new standard, one we'd fought for, together, and one I'd protect, for as long as I led.